morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 37th episode of 2024. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast. Yesterday, the Fiber Broadband Association submitted our comments to NTI on its proposed guidance for alternative technologies for BEAD. Opening the door to unreliable broadband alternatives is a really bad idea, as there's not going to be any other funding that's going to come along to upgrade these communities that NTI wants the states to leave behind. Today, the Fiber Broadband Association's Public Policy Committee is holding a Fiber Day in the capital of Iowa. Iowa is woefully underfunded on BEAD, and so we need to ensure their legislator does not leave any farm or family behind. Some good news is that NTI continues to execute on their commitment to get states' initial BEAD proposals approved by the end of summer. 40 states and territories are now approved, and there's only 16 left to go. And yesterday also was our regional Fiber Connect workshop in Iowa. It's just, wow, what a great turnout. The Iowa event was focused on precision agriculture, and Iowa is the nation's top producer of beef, pork, corn, soybeans, and grain. So as you might imagine, precision agriculture is paramount to the Hawkeye State. Coming up, our next Fiber Connect workshop will be in Latin America in Panama City, Panama. That'll be on October 1st and 2nd. Then we'll be up in Canada, in Calgary, Alberta on October 8th. And then we'll close out the year in Albuquerque, New Mexico with our tribal broadband focus on November 7th. So we'll see you guys at some of those events. And that brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session. Our guests today are Mike Buell, the Director of Indigenous Programs, and Frank Horn, the Director of Workforce Development with the Indigenous Connectivity Institute, discuss advancing digital equity among Indigenous communities in Canada and the U.S. But before I introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you to everybody who's joining us today. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to just once again thank our platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, if everyone would please keep in mind, all participants are in listen-only mode today. To ask a question, please type it into the question box located within the control panel on the upper right of your screen. We will host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is also being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours. And you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to do so. We appreciate your input. And with that, I will pass things back over to Gary to get us started. Gary?
Well, thanks, David. And good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber Breakfast, our guest was my good friend Vincent Gagne, the Director General of the Fiber to the Home Council in Europe, discussed the status of fiber in Europe and around the globe. I was with Vincent and the leaders of the Fiber Council from all the world's regions at the Fiber Council Global Alliance Global Summit last week in Kuala Lumpur. We all meet monthly to collaborate and share best practices as we work to connect everyone in the world with fiber. And if you missed last week's session with Vincent, you can go to the FBA website and watch the replay. Today on Fiber Breakfast, our guests are Mike Buell, who's the Director of Indigenous Programs, and Frank Horn, the Director of Workforce Development with the Indigenous Connectivity Institute, discuss advancing digital equity among Indigenous communities in Canada and U.S. Mark is the Director of the Indigenous Programs at Connect Humanity. Prior to joining Connect Humanity, Mark spent 6 years with Internet Society, most recently as the Regional Vice President for North America. In his role, he worked with a variety of stakeholders in Canada and U.S. and around the world, from policymakers and community members to the technical community and civil society. Asination Frank Horn, I know I messed that up. I don't speak Mohawk very well, specializes in Indigenous community engagement. He has dedicated his 20-year career to bridging the digital gap with Indigenous communities. Frank previously worked for Roger Communications, the bridge to the digital divide for Indigenous communities in the telecom space. And Asination, I wish I could say that better, patterns his passion after his parents, observing them, their dedication to and their energy to helping Indigenous people caught in the criminal justice system. Asination is, I can't even say this, Kayan Kika, the people of the Flint, and from sister communities of the Kanawake, South Shores of Montreal, and the Kanatak, the neighboring Koa, Oka in Quebec. He's very proud of his ancestral roots and their resiliency to centuries of colonialism. So, Frank, you're going to have to fix all my bad pronunciations. So, welcome, Mark and Frank. And for our audience, please type in your questions to go, and we'll work them into the discussion. With that, I'll hand it over to Mark and Frank.
Thanks, Gary. David, could we get the next slide? We're very pleased to be here today. This is a really good opportunity for us to talk about the important work that we do and expand, our partnerships with FBA and FBA's members. Frank and I are from the Indigenous Connectivity Institute, and we'd like to, well, next slide. I think that would be the, We're going to start off by talking a bit about who the Indigenous Connectivity Institute is, why we exist, what we do, talk a bit about our challenges, but with a particular focus this time on Canada, given the FBA has an upcoming event in Calgary that we're really excited about. And Frank is actually speaking on a panel at that event. So it'd be a good opportunity to provide some context for what you may hear when you're in Calgary. The ICI is a relatively new organization. We're established in 2022, but the work we do goes back quite a few years. A lot of the work started when I was still at the Internet Society in around 2016, essentially when my department was given a small budget and told to go fix the digital divide. By small budget, I mean small budget, not $70 billion. So fixing the digital divide wasn't really a possibility, but what we could do is bring people together to work together. We could provide the platform for people to work together to examine the unique challenges faced by Indigenous communities and perhaps start working together to bridge those challenges. And that's really what happened. We started something called the Indigenous Connectivity Summit, which has become an annual event held in North America. It's now the largest and I think most significant gathering of Indigenous network operators, service providers, leadership, community members, you name it. Out of that, we developed several other programs that are meant to address the digital divide that persists among Indigenous communities in Canada and the US, including a lot of training work and policy advocacy. And it was all great work at the Internet Society. The only challenge was that it was being done by a non-Indigenous organization. And we always thought it should be an Indigenous-led project. So in 2022, we transitioned all of that work over to an organization called Connect Humanity as part of the process to creating a new institution, which has become the ICI. We've since earlier this year, transitioned out of Connect Humanity and are now hosted by an Indigenous-owned nonprofit fiber company out of Manitoba in Canada. So we are now an entirely Indigenous organization in terms of leadership. Next slide, David. So I said we'd talk a bit about the Canadian context, or really focus on the Canadian context. And part of that is because a lot of what happens in Canada can be replicated in the US and vice versa. But in Canada, we have some particular challenges that I think might be of interest to everyone on the call today. But some context about Indigenous peoples in Canada. There are actually 3 constitutionally recognized Indigenous peoples north of the border: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, each with a different governance relationship and policy relationship with the government of Canada. In the country, there are about 1.8 million people who identify as Indigenous, so it's about 5% of Canada's total population. a little higher than in the US, which I think is around 2%. But one thing to note about the population here is that it's very young and it's growing much faster than the general Canadian population. I think, as everyone knows, Canada is a very large country. The majority of people in Canada live within 100 miles of the US border. However, Indigenous communities are most often characterized by being either very remote or very rural, small population, talking under 1,000 people, and face unique challenges relative to the general population of Canada. Next slide, where I'll talk a bit about what connectivity looks like in Indigenous communities in Canada. There are two slides that we're going to look at. The first one looks at First Nations communities and the state of connectivity as of 2022. You can see the green dots identify communities that either have a fiber backbone or have funded plans to put a fiber backbone in place. And the red dots show communities that do not have a fiber backbone. And 97 of those communities have no backbone at all. So you can see things are looking really good in the southern part of Canada. There are pockets where there isn't great access, but as you move into the more sparsely populated areas, you can see the red really starts to appear. And as you move north, you get into Inuit regions in the northern territories of Canada. So David, next slide. And it shows connectivity in the three territories in Canada. You can see it's almost entirely satellite dependent right now. This image is slightly old. It's from 2018. So the communities on the bottom right of your screen, some of those now have fiber access through some submarine fiber, but for the most part, you're looking at pretty old school satellite dependent communities. Not a lot of fiber and not a lot of plans to bring fiber there, which is a challenge for us. Next slide. So what are the real barriers to deploying high quality and affordable access in Canada? Like I say, remote communities with low population density, simply reality is no one's going to be deploying high quality internet service out to a community 1,000 miles away from the next community with a population of 300. So there's no real return on investment for the traditional telco model. Given the remoteness, the vast distances we have to travel, networks involve very high capex and opex costs. In the northern parts of the country, we have very short shipping seasons. There are some communities where all supplies for the year, including fuel to produce electricity, have to be shipped up on one barge. And if the ice doesn't break up in time, that community misses out on that shipment. In Canada, and similar to different states in the US, we have a policy and funding environment that really isn't conducive to community-driven connectivity solutions. Like I say, there's not a lot of ROI for traditional telcos. So a lot of our work focuses on working with communities to develop their own networks. Of course, colonialism, systemic racism, and the multi-generational legacy of residential schools plays a role. But I will say the number one barrier we've seen over many years of doing this work to deploying good internet access is a lack of qualified, skilled people in the more remote and rural areas of the country. If you think about a remote community that's fly-in only, if the network goes down, someone from the south has to fly in. That may result in days or weeks long outages. Frequently, I can tell you the story about one community that had no access for a month because a blizzard came in, and then a blizzard came into the community where the technician would have flown out of, and it took a month before their network was back up and running due to just a minor local issue. We believe that if people in community have the skills and knowledge needed to to build and repair the networks, outages wouldn't be as frequent. Given we don't have a lot of time, I don't have much else to say. I'd rather have a bit of a conversation. But Frank, is there anything you'd like to add?
Thanks, Mark. No, great summary of what we do at ICI. And the reason why I'm honored to be part of the team is I believe in it's what I see there is kind of a mission statement, and we identify the need, and it's huge. And if you are any way connected to community, you see it. It cuts across pretty much every facet of life. And to me, the way things have been in broadband connectivity to having safe and reliable or cost-effective internet is almost like square one to be able to move and have a vibrant community. And so to me, that's a mission worth dedicating my time to. So that's why I do this work. So Gary, in terms of the introduction to, I do apologize for you bumbling my name, but you did a great job. So I'll maybe another time I'll teach you how to say it properly. But anyway, there's a reason why we're code speakers, because it was hard for people that didn't speak Indigenous language to understand it. So we were great in war to speak and transfer wartime messages.
Well, even, one of the things that, well, first of all, thanks, Mark and Frank. I really appreciate you guys being here. But, Rob Griffin, one of our tribal chiefs and part of our tribal broadband at our conference, talked about how fiber broadband is able to save the culture of the tribes. And, as the tribal leadership is aging out, their language is starting to get lost. And by being able to preserve the language using broadband, are you guys seeing the same thing with Indigenous communities across Canada?
I can tell you a personal story for that, Gary. I'm of the generation where I would say not many of my age group we may have heard it, if we hear it, listen with it, they speak the language, but we're able to speak maybe at a toddler level. And so my mom is fluent in the language. My dad understands it, but responds in English. So I grew up around the house, but it was never taught to me as a young child. And so that's the big regret in the home that I grew up in. But to make up for lost time, which is a passion project for my mom and her sister, my auntie, is we have weekly Zoom calls to teach myself and my brothers and sisters, and even have a separate call with it to start revitalizing the language. And so that's just in my personal family. But that couldn't have happened without my family having access to internet, because there's no way I could do that the old school method.
No, there's a lot at stake, and losing cultures, and I think one of the things that you guys have talked about is trying to preserve your culture and history through centuries of colonialism, and we're a generation from losing all that, right? So we need to be able to preserve this important history. One of the other things that kind of strikes me is, you have all these satellites, but I'm assuming those are geostationary satellites. Is that right? That you're getting broadband connectivity with?
Correct.
Yeah. So
And
not good broadband, very bad latency. And so, how are these communities today able to have access to healthcare or education or jobs?
yeah, and that's the crux of it all right now, isn't it? It's incredibly challenging. A lot of these communities, if we talk about school, just elementary through high school, communities have high schools, but if you want to finish, communities have elementary schools, but if you want to finish high school, that means leaving, going south, leaving your family, leaving your community, the only community you've ever known, to finish high school. So you end up with lower graduation rates. In communities where there is decent access, students are able to complete their high school online, take classes through Zoom or whatever other technology is being used. So you can imagine that very remote communities, also very limited healthcare services. The potential for telemedicine, telehealth is huge. In fact, that's, Gary, actually how I got involved in the internet policy world. Was I was doing, my background's actually in Indigenous health policy, and working in the Arctic in the early 2000s when things like electronic health records and good telemedicine was coming out. I thought that could be the savior for a lot of communities. However, you needed a good broadband connection. So I wound up becoming more of a broadband expert than a broadband advocate than a health advocate.
So one of the things that uh, we have some really good questions. Some very smart people on the line here, but is that Indigenous Connectivity Institute been involved and react, or have you reacted to the UN policy brief, Global Compact or Digital Compact, the Global Digital Compact, and the compact is central to the UN Summit of the Future, um, September 20th, and it's Pact for the Future, and they want digital everywhere and every school to be connected by 2023. One of the problem challenges is no distinction in the document between fiber and other unreliable broadband connections. Um, you know, you have some comments on that statement?
Yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting statement, and the digital compact is it's a step forward. We did not engage in the process. We have not commented on it. Gary, I definitely agree with you. You know, there's no differentiation between uh, broadband and fiber and other forms of connectivity. Uh, that's a bit of a challenge to do when you're talking about an international agreement, because we know there are some parts of the world where we need some transition transition technologies. It's going to be challenging to deploy fiber to everyone everywhere. We certainly see that in the north, but we're always advocating for the gold standard, which is fiber. Uh, what we have in the north right now, Arctic regions, like you say, geostationary satellites, not great. There may be some potential with low Earth orbit satellites. That kind of remains to be seen. But an area of work that's emerging for us is around ensuring Indigenous peoples are participants in global internet governance discussions. So at the UN, at places like the Internet Governance Forum, the UN's Internet Governance Forum, places like ICANN, where naming and numbering is taken care of, and the ITU, where spectrum is allocated regionally. So uh, we're in the midst of building a program around building capacity of Indigenous peoples to participate in those discussions.
So one of the questions that came in is just, when you're trying to think about how you could actually build out a internet connectivity plan to these communities, is there a map locating the various indigenous communities so we can kind of plan out some kind of fiber route?
There are maps. Yes, we have maps. We have maps of not the entirety of North America, but a lot of communities. What they have right now. What we're lacking actually is a map of where there's existing fiber that may pass close to those communities that they could tap into.
So,
Yeah.
right.
So to that question, the Assembly of First Nation, which is a national Indigenous organization that kind of advocates for the 600 plus First Nations in Canada, they did a infrastructure gap report for all the infrastructure, including broadband, and they, based on their assessment, and I think they were in consultation with some telcos, they said their number is $5 billion. But what that $5 billion deficit is, does it include what is it? Is it just fiber, or are the other forms of connectivity? We're not sure, but there has been some sort of preliminary assessments as to where the gaps are, which includes the maps.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of Canada, 90% of the population's within 100 miles of the U.S. border. So we're
Yep.
talking about 10% of Canadians that are really kind of left to their own devices to try to figure out how to get access to just basic connectivity. And best case is some kind of geostationary satellite and maybe Starlink if you're lucky. Um, I want to kind of, Frank, go back to your parents' work.
Okay.
When I look at the U.S., we lock up more people per capita in any other nation in the world. And when I think about fiber connectivity, I think, a large percentage of the people in the judicial system are kind of victims of circumstance. They just don't have the opportunities for education and jobs and so forth. What is the environment like? I mean, if you're so remote and you don't have that access to education and jobs, I mean, is there a high level of alcoholism and drug use and and people that end up in the judicial system? Or how would you see fiber being able to help people be able to keep people from ending in with that bad outcome?
Sure, yeah. So my father is a criminal lawyer, and the reason he chose that path for himself is when he was a young man in his early 20s, he had an opportunity to go to the Northern Ontario, which is just as remote as the far north, and he saw firsthand what it was like up there in terms of the social issues, and so when he came back home to the Montreal area, he talked to a gentleman who's kind of became his father figure because his own father passed away, and said, "What are you going to do about it?" And basically, he helped him get through law school, and that was his path to kind of help out. And my dad was just one man trying to do it in a city in southern Ontario, and he got burnt out after a while because it was just the influx of Indigenous people going through the system was overwhelming, and the court system realized my dad was the one Indigenous lawyer that did more than just your traditional stuff for them. And so I saw that passion for it. But so when my dad found out that I switched careers from helping community in housing to broadband, my dad didn't understand it at first. But once I kind of told him, he got it right away, and which is surprising because my dad's, he's 80 something now, and when he talks to his people about what his boys are doing, his oldest son Frank, he's proud that he sees the path forward, because I showed him some videos as to what connectivity can mean to the communities, and he sees that that's a way, it's a path to be able to do it. So he's kind of advocating in his own little small world of what it can do. So to your question about the deficit is so high, that the need is so large, and if someone like my father's age can understand it, who he can't use a cell phone, but he understands what internet can do, and he advocates for it, I think it's something that's because even to this day, the issues that were there 30, 40 years ago is just as rampant, and it's the same thing with in the jail system, and I work with family violence shelters and people transitioning out of the justice system, and the numbers are much higher within the Indigenous community than the non-Indigenous community. And to your point about not having a fair shake to start out, it's very problematic. And I count myself lucky that I had mother and father that stabilized the home, so I didn't have to think about that. I can work on my own career, but I was lucky that way. And a lot of my Indigenous people that I'm aware of, it's not the same. And I hear the stories, and it's heartbreaking. But what I like about ICI is they see the need, and what we're trying to do is fix it at a very basic level, from an infrastructure level.
Well, Mark and Frank, I mean, these are the kind of things that we're going to be talking about in Calgary on October 8th. I can't think of anything more important on the planet than make sure that we leave no one behind and provide everyone with the opportunity for world-class education, healthcare, and access to jobs so they can all be productive members of society. So really appreciate everything that you guys are doing. And I look forward to getting back together. Next Wednesday, we're going to be talking to Robert Geets, the CEO of the Canadian Telecommunications Association, to discuss the state of broadband in Canada. And we'll be able to ask him some questions on how we're going to get connectivity to every community, big or small, and no matter where it's located in Canada and Alaska. We can talk about tribal nations, even in urban areas, being able to get it just to subsidized living. There's pockets of people being left behind, and we can't allow that to happen. So thanks to you guys for everything you're doing, and I can't wait to see you guys in Calgary. Thanks, everyone. See you guys next Wednesday.
Thank you.